Obviously, it's wrong to kill people. If we have only one moral rule, it's that. Everything else can fall away, and we'll still have a civil society. But if we lose the value of human life, there's nothing left right and wrong. Rebecca wasn't being smug. That word is reserved for people who want to draw attention to how right they are. Rebecca simply took the solemnity of her words for granted, without pomp or circumstance. Drew rolled his eyes dramatically, enough so that everybody in Mr. Gridlow's 11th grade history class could see it. What about war, Rebecca? Are you going to argue that human nature can just be ignored when we decide to battle over our differences? She returned a cold look. Obviously, there are exceptions, Drew. It's morally acceptable to kill in certain circumstances, but only if it's isolated to a declared combat zone. It's fine as long as it's kept within the boundaries. She crossed her arms with finality, obviously irritated at being questioned. As for me, I don't have a single word to say. You ain't shit, kid. Corporal Brewer shouted at me as we carried our gear into the bunks. 5 minutes into basic and you're already responsible for more unit-group push-ups than everybody else combined. He grinned. You're in for a rough road. Washington was looking at him with something that resembled disgust. Can it, Brewer? A voice came from behind me. The corporal looked over my shoulder and he dropped his grin. He flashed his eyes back and forth between me and the man behind me. Sure, Poppy. He looked back to me and he smirked once more before walking it off. He'll find his own way soon enough. I turned around to see a tall, dark-skinned E-5 standing behind me. He looked to be much older, maybe 30. Poppy? He gave the hint of a smile. Yep, a bit of advice, man. Basic training's purpose is to kick the shit out of you and see what kind of man is left standing. Our purpose is to turn living people into dead ones out in this hellhole we call Iraq. If you get shaken up by the assholes like Martinez, the people who die will be the wrong ones. Capiche? I nodded slowly. Good, he said, turning to walk away. You're in this unit. Always watch your back. Not everybody's gonna come back, so try not to get yourself screwed. I really didn't want to wear my Class A's, but what rule is this? It had been 4 years. Is this time right? I was home for good and I was ready to put this behind me. But the way that Dad slapped his hand on my uniform shoulder, and the way that Mom kept bringing her friends over to introduce me, made it pretty goddamn clear that they weren't quite over it yet. If it were up to me, I sure as hell would not be standing here, in the middle of a giant ballroom, surrounded by hundreds of strangers drifting around sans purpose. Okay, I'm not exactly in the middle of the room. I'm not an idiot. I'm in the corner, but that seems to make me stand out even more somehow. There are literally over 100 people in this room. I don't know how much more I can take. Have you met the Hopkins? Mom asked, breaking my reverie by resting a hand on my back. I regained my composure quickly, but it took 5 minutes for my heart rate to return to normal. Gerald and Rosemary Hopkins asked me how long I served, whether I knew anybody who had died, what I thought of politics, and all manner of intrusive questions designed to convey dignity and admiration. 4 years, yes, and not much. Do you have any scars? Rosemary asked suddenly. When I replied with only a vacant stare, she tried a different approach. Did you get shot or injured, William? I tried to focus on what she said. No, Mrs. Hopkins, I didn't. The room was hot, way too hot. There were 4 exits and of course I was near one of them, but I started to wonder if I was blocked. I looked around to see which one of the 3 would be the best alternative. They were all too far. The walls were too close. The panic began. Well, that's excellent, dear. Not everybody is so lucky, you know, to come home without any damage whatsoever. We were headed northwest into Tikrik with 15 vehicles in the convoy when it happened. Get off the transport and see if you can get a signal. Poppy shouted above the roaring engine as we slowed to a stop. This stretch of desert was notoriously difficult for its isolation, even with satellite phones. Is this right? The truck pulled over, and I hopped off with the intent of crossing a trench to climb a small rise in the earth just off the edge of the road. Poppy stepped out to follow me, and then the sky ripped open. No amount of training can prepare a man to face that. It's no more possible to ready yourself for death than it would have been to prepare yourself for birth. Death reaches out knowing that it can take pieces of you, even if the whole is still behind its reach. He's patient. He knows we'll get it all one day. The second IED came from behind, and 2 vehicles already down, with just 13 left in the convoy. I turned around stupidly, just to see what the hell was going on when I was thrown violently into the trench. The noise that followed was deafening. I tried to make sense of things, but there was only pain and light and noise. It took me a few seconds, but I figured out that the noise was Poppy. He was on top of me, and it was him who had thrown me into the ditch. It was only a foot deep, so I could clearly see over the edge at the smoldering wreckage of her truck. An RPG had reduced it to scrap iron. I still pray each night that the ones left inside died instantly, and didn't slowly barbecue to death. I doubt God hears my prayers. Down, stay down, watch your back. Poppy was lying flat on my body and screaming in my face, but it took a while to understand him. When I slowly nodded, he peeked his head over the edge of the tiny ditch and took aim with his M4. He was able to get 3 shots off before they found him. Poppy's head, or what was left of it, snapped violently backward before his body keeled over and landed in my lap. His skull had been opened like a sardine can. It's amazing what our brains do in times of absolute shock. Mine took in the details of what was happening with meticulous impartiality. Papa's brain spilled out like SpaghettiOs onto my lap. Brains have a distinct smell, but I cannot describe it. It's just brain smell. I must have watched his foot twitch for 20 minutes. I felt it too, since Poppy was a big guy and his body was pinning me down. There wasn't much that I could do. Getting out of the ditch would have been suicide. They had my position in their sights, and my own M4 had been left in the now charred truck. We were eventually pulled out by our unit, which rolled in after an airstrike cleared most of the terrorists. We never made it to Tikrit. Dr. Skinner's office is just like I'd expected it to be. There's something comforting about degrees mounted on white walls. They're not dynamic, they don't move, they're still. His window offered a picture-perfect view of the Gateway Arch and Busch Stadium. It really was quite pleasant. Skinner himself was nearly grandfatherly. His frame was slight but wiry. His white mustache and beard were cut very short and well-kept. And his pale skin proved that he had spent nearly every one of God's beautiful days locked sensibly indoors and focused on his life's work. Let's talk about what it's like to be home, William, he offered conversationally. I smiled. What's there to say? It's nice. Calmer. It's good to decompress. I offered as a token of my willingness to communicate. That was a good word, decompress. It gave them what they sought without setting off any triggers. Skinner's forehead wrinkled. I can imagine it is. But tell me, did you leave any part of yourself behind when you departed Iraq? I shifted in my chair. Sure, I had memories that still made me cry, but he wasn't going to get them out of me. I saw that fact left to keep my dignity intact. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Dr. Skinner, I responded innocuously. Please, William, call me Ben. He leaned forward. I just want to know, when you were there, what did you see? Washington may have been the only black soldier in our company, but what really made him stand out was his awkwardness. When I saw him corner Lysette while in the mess line, I could only cringe at his awkward attempts at flirting were met with dismissal that he clearly wasn't able to comprehend. When she tried to get around him for the third time, and he responded by awkwardly blocking her for the third time, I almost wanted to intervene. I chose, however, to not get involved. Brewer did not make that same choice. Washington was face first on the ground before he knew that he had been attacked. When he lifted his head, blood was streaming from his nose and mouth. Brewer knelt over him and pushed his hand down on Washington's neck. "She doesn't like you. Figure it out, shit for brains." Washington tried to move, but Brewer just pushed down harder. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I waited for Lysette to say something. When that didn't happen, I waited for Washington to defend himself. When he lay still, bloodshot eyes staring at nothing, I waited for it to be over. Brewer finally seemed satisfied, so he stood up and he walked away. Washington stayed on the ground, staring unseeingly ahead, pouring blood and dripping tears. He was trembling. Nobody helped him to his feet. And later that night, no one helped him as he kicked the chair out from underneath him, completely alone, and found his solace at the end of a rope. A dozen little kids were lined up against the wall, each jumping rope with varying degrees of success. Snap, snap, snap went the ropes. I turned to stare uncomprehendingly at Henry. He was smiling, obviously awaiting my response to something that I hadn't heard. This situation used to bother me, but I had grown accustomed to living around gaps in time. I smiled back at him. "You think so?" He scoffed in surprise. "Are you kidding me? This town knows who you are. I've heard you're going to be in the 4th of July parade. It is an honor to add a veteran to our employment ranks. I have a feeling that you teach a thing or two to these rascals." He jerked a thumb over his left shoulder. "They can be a handful." Crack. What the hell is wrong with you? A pudgy boy was towering over a smaller one, who stared up at his tormentor in fear. "Why'd you hit me with the gosh dang rope?" The smaller boy raised his arms in a pathetic defense as the pudgy one pinned him face first on the ground. When the victim lifted his head, blood was streaming from his nose and mouth. I waited for Henry to say something. I looked at the boy to defend himself. When that didn't happen, I took it upon myself to pull the pudgy boy off of his victim. I felt pride at handling the situation. It took several seconds to realize that a distant warbling sound from above me was yelling. Henry was screaming at me. I hadn't noticed. "Stop! Stop! What are you doing to him? Let him go!" I was confused. I had stopped the situation. There was no reason for Henry to scream. I looked below me. What I saw there overwhelmed me with vertigo. The pudgy boy was lying on the ground beneath my knees, barely conscious. His nose and mouth were covered in his own blood. So were my hands. Attacks in the field can happen at any time. A ready trigger finger, one that knows how to operate independently of any conscious thought, was a must-have for anybody who aspired to grow old one day. I had bent down to tie my boot that night, and by turn of fortune, Brewer's laces had stayed tied. That changed everything for us. There was noise before anything, and then the white flash. Unrelenting fire from 5 different assault rifles came from 3 different directions. I dropped to the ground and I crawled behind the nearest vehicle. Brewer was shot in the knee. He screamed. It wasn't the dignified wail of a brave man facing the most harrowing trial of his masculinity. No, the kid was straight up crying, blubbering even as he cradled his shattered leg. He gurgled while rolling back and forth. "Someone get my back!" He dropped his head to the sandy ground before looking up at me through teary eyes. "Help me please, William. It hurts so much." His words trailed off as a fresh wave of crying overtook him. I was 15 feet away. It would have taken 20 seconds tops to scramble out to him and pull him behind the vehicle. I didn't move. He locked eyes with me. Both of us understood in that moment that I would leave him there. He sobbed harder. The noise was cut short with a splat. The sand erupted from the ground near Brewer's head and sprinkled me with a light dusting. His lone remaining eye remained locked on mine. I snapped my head up to see that the terrorist had exposed too much of himself when shooting Brewer. His torso was now an easy target for me. The mistake would cost him dearly, and my focus was entirely on him. I aimed. No wonder he'd been so dumb. The kid standing not 50 feet away wasn't a day older than 12. He turned to look at me, but was too young and inexperienced to appreciate just how vulnerable his position was. It took me one shot to eliminate the threat. He didn't even have time to cry. The pudgy kid had been too catatonic to cry, but his mom was apoplectic, and my attempts to comfort her went nowhere. "It's okay," I offered in a voice that was drowned by her screaming. "I'm sure he isn't going to die." For some reason, that just made things worse. "This is not okay," Henry explained later as we were sitting in his office. "This is going to take a lot of work to fix." I stared unseeingly ahead. I don't know what happened. How can I fix something that I didn't realize was broken? Henry closed his eyes and he sighed. "You're not going to be the one fixing this, William." He opened them again and he looked at me sadly. "What you did is too far beyond the pale." The walls began to close. I didn't understand why. "Henry, you have to give me a chance to fix this." He dismissed me with a quick flick of his head. "Not something like this, William. Something so extreme that there's no precedent, no comparison. I've never met a man like you. Maybe it's best to accept that some things are too broken to fix." Something had broken into the enemy lines. The kid lay in a heap in front of me. The rest of the terrorists had stopped their firing and I could hear them running away, like scared children. The slap on my back nearly sent me into a panic attack, and when Martinez spun me around and shook me, I could feel the walls closing in, and I remembered the pop and I knew that I was going to die. And then he embraced me in a bear hug and the walls did close in. He was screaming at me. "You did it!" He spun me around to the point at the dead kid. I watched, transfixed as his foot twitched. Martinez shook me once more and he clapped his hand on my back. "You used to be such a baby. I knew we could fix you." Gerald Hopkins thumped his hand on my back. "Anyway, Mayor Thurber, I appreciate you smoothing this over. I know that William made a mistake with that boy at the summer camp, but the 4th of July parade really would be better with him in it." I didn't feel like looking at the mayor, so I stared down at my hands. There had been blood on my hands and I fidgeted, like I was in a place where I didn't belong. I could feel the mayor staring at me. They trained us to know when people are watching us, because that's the only way to avoid getting hurt. I can vouch for William. I've known his father through the very worst of times. Here he withdrew his hand from my back. "Besides," he continued, "don't we remember and honor all who served, even if they make mistakes?" "Let me tell you about a mistake," I spat out. They both froze. When Washington was pinned to the ground and staring at nothing, it was because he needed someone. Just one. I knew I could have been that one. Any of us could have. And we all chose not to be there. And that was a mistake. I ran out of words before I ran out of meaning. I stood up and I walked out of the office. Our platoon gathered for a formal goodbye when Brewer's remaining pieces were loaded onto the plane. They brought a major in to give a speech. "Corporal Brewer was more than a man," the major said, solemnly as we stood at attention. "Men are courageous when they sacrifice for themselves. But Corporal Brewer made a sacrifice for something greater. He was ready to back any of the men around him, because their well-being mattered most to him. The people of Iraq, the people of the United States, and freedom-loving people around the world are only able to have hope for their own futures when people like Corporal Brewer become something more than men. He is a soldier, and he will be forever remembered as such. I knew that that was wrong. Brewer wasn't just a man on the inside. I had seen it torn open. It was a hot, cloudless day. The major stepped aside and I saw a second coffin next to the spot where they had laid Brewer. I could barely make out the word Washington written on the side. I nudged the guy next to me. "They're loading 2 coffins in. Why did we only see one get loaded?" He looked at me with annoyance. "You mean for Washington?" He scoffed. "He did it to himself. Why would we pay attention to that?" "Just don't say anything," Dad said gruffly as I sat in the back seat of the 1957 Ford Mustang convertible. "Neither Mayor Thurber nor Gerald Hopkins wanted anything to do with you, but everybody wants to see a soldier. Just sit and wave and, William, please, don't give voice to anything that you're feeling." It was a hot, cloudless day. The car rolled slowly down the street, and nausea bubbled up in my stomach as I realized just how slowly the Mustang was moving. There were people lined up on both sides of the street, hundreds of them. I did not like that. Since there was no roof on the car, everybody could see me. That seemed like such a bad idea. It was very hot. The 1944 Willys MB Jeep ahead of us did not move very fast, so we kept an extremely slow pace, and every single person could see me. Every single one. In front of us, the Jeep backfired. I reacted immediately this time, jumping out from the Humvee and running away from the exploded Jeep. It had been so engulfed in flames that there is no point in trying to find survivors. It's much easier to tell that to myself. I ran back down the dirt road as I heard my Humvee explode behind me. A coating of dirt rained down on me as I sprinted away. There was no shelter either side of the dirt road. It was a hot, cloudless day. "Get the hell out of here!" Someone screamed from behind me. "This road's too exposed." It was the last thing that he ever said. I ran. And I kept running until I saw an alley on my right. I turned into it and barreled along the edge of the building. I dove behind a dumpster and I curled up into a ball. I heard footsteps behind me, but there was nowhere else to go. Dad emerged from around the edge of the dumpster. He was wheezing. I tried to understand the expression on his face, but I was unable to. I knew that it was a bad expression, but faces didn't make as much sense as they used to. The individual parts all moved, but I couldn't understand what they meant when they were all together. Dad was crying. He knelt down and he rested his hands very lightly on my shoulders. They were shaking, like he was afraid of me. "Why did you run away from everyone?" His voice was trembling. I didn't like the way his hands touched my shoulders. "What the hell is wrong with you, William?" He sniffed. "Where did my son go?" I was disgusted by his tears because I had never seen him cry. I didn't know about my own tears until I felt them on my cheek. We had been saved by an airstrike because you never know who's watching from above. That night was spent at Camp Dreamland in Fallahu with the 3rd Infantry. Things were not going well. We knew that an attack was coming. I went to sleep with that knowledge. So when the screaming and shouting woke me up, I was ready. I was the first one out of bed, and I ran out of the room before anybody else could. A mortar landed behind me. I didn't want to look back because I knew it had landed where I had just been sleeping. I ran faster. Other people were running and screaming around me. I knew that I had to get to the armory. I ran down the hall and I yanked open the door. There was only a Beretta M9 in front of me. I wanted something more powerful, but I took it and I ran down the hall. "There's someone in here," a voice screamed in the darkness. I raised the beretta and I shot the darkness, and then I ran towards the sound. I saw a figure dart around the corner, and my heart rate soared. I wasn't ready for this fight, with just a pistol in the clothes that I had been sleeping in, but I didn't have a choice. I was in it now. I peeked around the corner and I saw the shadow running down the hall. It had gotten so quiet, and I raised the beretta and I fired. I missed again. The shadow screamed and I dove to the ground. "Please!" It screamed at me. The shadow raised its arms into the air. I had no idea why a terrorist would be surrendering here. It didn't make sense. We both knew that I'd have to kill it. I heard it crying. I was disgusted but confused. "Show yourself! Show me who you are!" Spit flew from my mouth. Moonlight was spilling in through the window. I stepped around the corner, gun raised as the shadow got to its knees in the pale light. "Please," it wept. "Please don't hurt me, William." Cowering, sobbing, and broken, my mother raised her hands above her head in surrender. Inches from her head, a fresh bullet hole now marred the wall of my childhood home. I wanted to tell her that everything was alright, that we were safe, but when I tried to lower the gun, it wouldn't budge an inch. "And that's what I saw, Dr. Skinner," I offered, voice trembling. She was afraid of me. I blinked. And she still is. She always will be. He wrinkled his forehead once more as he scratched his snow-white beard. "Do you think she should be afraid for you?" My eyes burned and I could feel my dignity slipping. I hated him for it. "You're not really decompressing, are you, William?" My breaths were coming in shorter gasps. "Let's talk about admitting that something got left behind in Iraq. How does it feel when people refuse to treat you that way? Is it hard to let something go when those around you won't let you be complete in your brokenness?" I did not like being in this chair, and I did not like the view over the city. People could monitor me so easily. It was impossible to watch my back. "William, you can't come home unless you show yourself to the people around you." I snapped my head towards him as he continued to speak. "Show yourself to me, William." He smiled broadly, and the lines of his deeply tanned cheeks cascaded into ripples, lips spilling wide over his crooked teeth. The thick pungent smoke rose from the Mabhara on his right, and the smell made my head foggy. "You don't have to watch your back all the time." He stroked the thick, bristly hairs of his dark beard. "You can let me in." I closed my eyes because the keffiyeh wrapped around his head looked to be squeezing his brain, compressing it until it squirted around the folds like a child squeezing a lump of Play-Doh between his fingers. My eyes stung. The voice that came from inside me seemed unfamiliar, distant, and traitorous. Sometimes I don't know what's real. The wetness of my cheeks had proved that my head had betrayed me, that my dignity could not stay intact forever, that time would always win. Sometimes I don't know if I came home.